私動けない。もうこれ以上動けない。お姉様、あの人が死んでしまう。地球に帰ったってもうあの人はいないわ。私まだ何も言ってないのに。好きだった、愛してると。
傷だらけ
国宇宙軍太陽系直縁部隊直属第6世代型高性間高校決戦兵器バスターマシン7号、そしてロノは本当にバカでした。バスターマシンがあるとかないとか関係ないのです。バスターマシンさえあればなんて思うものが本当のトップになれるはずがありません。なぜならば自分の力を最後まで信じる者にこそ真の力が宿るからです。きっと本物のバスターマシンパイロットは本物のノノリリは心にバスターマシンを持っているのだから。バスタービスラ
Wanna do just break the rules, then you see the truth. This is the people, cheek, cool baby. Roll, roll, fight. This is the people. This is the people. Second verse dedicated to the real peeps. What we gotta say. baby. Roll, roll, fight the power. See the invisible. Roll, roll, break the unbreakable. What you wanna do? Just break the rule, then you see the truth. This is the thing of G coming cool, baby. Roll, roll, fight the power. Power to the peeps, power for the dream. Still missing piece, scattering so incomplete. We be that most incredible soldier from underground. See how easy they all fall down. Digging through the core to see the light. Let's get out of here. On the set, do the image again. Sorry, my ride. Wow, break
experience with the series that they actually believed something like that would ever happen, and then there were the cynical franchise veterans who understood X-Ray Engine would sooner achieve sentience than it would grace the inner workings of console architecture. And don't get it twisted, that's not because Stalker was out here showing off the best graphics the industry had ever seen before. I mean, they got Crysis on the PS3 and 360. I'm sure Call of Pripyat's comparatively primitive visual effects could have been achievable too. Now, the real problem was the method of delivery for those effects, and everything else in the games. You see, Stalker was created with an engine that was held together with more hopes and dreams than actual computer code, and once someone came face to face with it, the idea that these games would ever be playable on console became a bit of an in-joke. Something we'd throw around sarcastically for the sheer ridiculousness of it. And to give you an idea of what I mean, we used to have to create a shortcut to shadowofchernobyls.exe to add some directions for Windows that would allow it to take advantage of more than 2 gigs of RAM. And this was on its native platform. Imagine trying to get a game like that running alongside the kind of overhead that can come from creating an environment to interpret computer stuff and turn it into something a console's more closed architecture can understand. Which is precisely why something like that is never, ever gonna happen.
2,000 years later.
Marked one. Follow your instincts. Good luck to you.
Okay, so yes, me from the early 2000s definitely has egg on his face for more reasons than I can count. But to be fair, it took so damn long for Stalker to make its way into your living room TV that I think we can effectively say we were all wrong. But now that everyone has access to these amazing titles, there's only one question left to answer. Did these ports stack up well enough against the originals to make them a good entry point for a person who wants to see what all the fuss is about? Well, that's where I come in. Stalkers, welcome to the zone.
Did you hear? Stalker's finally getting ported.
Bullshit. You're lying.
Alright, so before we dive into things proper, there were a few items worth getting out of the way. First off, we're going to be looking almost exclusively at the Xbox Series X version of all 3 Stalker games. And that's because when I started capturing footage for this video, which was admittedly a long time ago, I was playing the PS5 release of Call of Pripyat and noticed an absurdly long delay in the game's audio. And it seemed to be the most prevalent with gunshots, which is an issue for a first-person shooter. After doing a little research online, I found out this was an issue that everyone was having, so I figured if I was going to put more than 10 to 15 hours into each of these ports, it'd be a safe bet to go with the Series X versions that didn't suffer from this problem. That being said, since then the audio delay on PS5 has been fixed in a patch, leaving me with a single clip of proof that it ever happened in the first place. On the plus side though, I can confirm that there are no significant image or performance differences across the 2 consoles, so anything I say in this video should apply evenly to either one of them. And lastly, I'm gonna go ahead and warn you ahead of time, you will be seeing some very bad gameplay moving forward. Like, war crime levels of bad. Now, like I've said more times than I can actually count, when it comes to accurate shooting, whether it's first person or third, analog sticks in my hand may as well be a pair of Rubik's Cubes. And given Stalker's specific brand of FPS gameplay, I'm looking even worse than usual. The only reason I bring this up is so you guys don't see this awful footage and think it's due to some kind of a flaw with the port job here. We are going to dive deeper into how the collection controls later, but rest assured, my disabled thumbs aren't some kind of an indication of a problem with the games in it. Alright, I think that's about it for the prerequisites, so let's go ahead and start hunting artifacts and shooting at guys in balaclavas. The Stalker Legends of the Zone collection was released in March of 2024, ironically with more stealth than what's actually possible in the games themselves. Thanks to a few leaks, some rumors, and some more legit info, we knew there was going to be an announcement at the Xbox partner event concerning Stalker console ports. But GSC pulled some real wild shit and just released all 3 games with next to no fanfare long before that event even took place. So if this video ends up being the first time you're even hearing about the collection, that's kind of understandable. The wording that I saw from a lot of gaming outlets indicated that these would be remasters. And while there has been some work done to elevate these games just a bit above how they look in their vanilla form on PC, I wouldn't say they necessarily come close to being labeled that way. I'm not trying to be pedantic, but the original 3 releases of Stalker on PC are already capable of being pushed to 4K, so there wasn't really a need to do very much to these ports outside of just getting them to run on console hardware. And since we're on the subject, I'll go ahead and admit right now, I was not able to find a single piece of info on how these guys performed that feat. And I really did try to dig in deep during the research phase of writing this script, but if someone knows how the porting company Matabu did all of this, they're not talking about it online, or at least they weren't doing it anywhere where I was looking. So moving forward, I'm going to be doing a lot of educated guessing, or as I like to call it, business as usual. But let's go ahead and start off with something I do know. This collection is made up of Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat, and is available on the PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Series X or S, and the Switch. On the former part of that list, you can expect 4K video output and a 60 FPS frame rate target, while on PS4 and Xbox One, it's 1080p 30. As far as the Nintendo Switch is concerned, let's go ahead and assume it's the usual sub 720p internal render, blurrily upscaled to 1080p, and a frame rate target of, the Switch is genuinely a worse console than the Wii U. If we take a close look at the Series X and PS5 ports, it seems to me like they aren't actually running at true 4K internally, but instead maybe something closer to 1440p, which is then being upscaled to 4K. I could be wrong about this, but if we look at the PC original and the Legends of the Zone version side by side, the PC version does seem to show a good deal more detail and clarity at native 4K, so I'd say it's a safe bet that Matabu, the company in charge of the porting process, is scaling up from something lower than that. Of course, it is important to mention that I had to zoom in pretty far to accentuate the differences between the two, so it's a little more obvious when you guys are watching this on YouTube. But if you're just playing one of these games casually and not sticking your face up against your screen, the gap between the 2 ports is not what I would personally call significant. I mean, it's not like the console ports are soft looking or anything, they're just a little softer than the really sharp PC originals. And truth be told, I think the average person sitting on a couch a good 4 to 5 feet away from their TVs probably won't be able to tell a difference at all. As we've grown to expect in situations like this, any CG cutscenes included have been AI upscaled to look better at the target resolution. I will say the PC originals, at least to me, look just fine at 4K, but I can see why this might be a priority for a modern day port. And to be fair, it's not the worst use of this tech that I've seen in my time doing this, but it's also not the best. You can expect the usual suspects like over-sharpened details with ringing artifacts and a sort of diorama effect where objects in focus are so much more in focus than the backdrop that they stand out from the rest of the scene. In some high-contrast screens, pretty noticeable haloing is present on edges. And there's also this weird white bar at the bottom of the screen that I can't quite explain. I think it should be said that this is not a botched job or anything, but the fact of the matter is, upscaling tech just isn't good enough yet that a company can automate a process like this and not expect some noticeable visual artifacts. On the plus side though, in terms of frame rate, I found the story to be much more impressive. The 60 FPS target on both Series X and PS5 seems to be well locked in, with only a few small drops below 60 occurring every so often. As I captured my footage and put in more than 15 hours across all 3 Stalker games, I really wasn't able to feel any of those dips outside of a few isolated incidents, and for most of them, I only found out they existed later while running my footage through frame rate analysis software. And with how crazy I am about this stuff, I'd say it's totally possible that a good deal of people watching right now won't notice them either. Which, and yes, I realize I'm about to spit some heresy, but this is one area where the Legends of the Zone collection might actually pull ahead of the OG Stalker titles. For as long as I've been playing them, Stalker games on PC have suffered from intermittent frame time spikes that are so severe it can feel like the game's locked up for a brief moment. Now, since my captured footage is being compressed down from over 100 to 60 FPS, you probably won't be able to notice these taking place visually, but you can still see them represented by the graph in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And while looking at that, you can tell we have these few relatively small spikes occurring at constant intervals, but then out of nowhere these massive ones show up. That's where the game's hanging for a fraction of a second, and I can assure you, you can really feel these when they're taking place in real time. On the Series X though, this issue was essentially non-existent, which made the gameplay feel orders of magnitude more smooth than it ever has before. And you have to keep in mind, I've been playing these games since 2007. I played them for many hundreds of hours combined on both absolute garbage and top-of-the-line hardware. This issue has, annoyingly, always been present. So being able to experience a Stalker game without feeling that little hitch every so often is pretty damn revolutionary as far as I'm concerned. If we're being honest though, it's not necessarily the frame rate that interests me the most here, but instead what they're doing to maintain it. Now at first you might assume turning down graphical features would be the obvious move, but looking at both the originals and the console ports side by side, it seems to me that each entry in Legends of the Zone is operating at a level of fidelity very near what you'd see on PC with a mix of medium to max settings and full DirectX dynamic lighting. If I'm being picky, the only things that stand out to me as being turned down noticeably are the God rays in Clear Sky and the wet surface effects. Which does make sense because those were pretty taxing on hardware when these games first came out. So instead of dropping a whole bunch of settings down to keep things running smoothly, these ports appear to be taking advantage of real-time dynamic image scaling. Now, I can't be positive on the specifics because, like I said, official info on the development of these things is hard to come by, but it seems to me like on Series X and PS5, the resolution can drop to or around 1080p when things start to get a little too taxing to keep up that rock-solid frame rate. And since most of your time in these games is going to be spent looking at far-off sweeping vistas and smooth horizons, I would say this isn't really something that's going to jump out at you. To be totally honest, it even took me a good while to notice it because a solid portion of my time capturing footage was spent on my couch. I only started being able to see these drops in internal render resolution when switching over to my computer monitor, which is way closer to my face and arguably sort of defeats the purpose of these ports in the first place. Now, this did seem to happen more often in Call of Pripyat and Clear Sky, but that makes sense. Both of those games added a whole bunch of new lighting effects, cascading rain, and normal map surfaces that caused them to require significantly more resources to run well than Shadow of Chernobyl did. If we are going to be overly critical, it is a little disheartening that these beefy consoles struggle to hit 60 FPS at roundabout 1440p when realistically much less impressive PCs can achieve the same, if not better results. But to be fair, for all we know, there might be some wild overhead in terms of converting these games into something a home console can even interface with. And besides, it's not like the frame rate is really anything that's going to bother you, so this is more of a hypothetical curiosity than a genuine criticism. While trying to dig up info on the porting process used in Legends of the Zone, I found a post on Reddit that points out what I would call a fairly obvious use of generative AI to fill in the sides of the 4x3 loading screens in these games. And I would say this is a kind of gray area issue, because on one end, it definitely would be nice if this company would have paid a real artist to have drawn some assets to fill this area in, but on the other, I mean, it is a very, very minute portion of the job they did, like not even 1% of the total. I mean, I do agree that it would be ideal if the games industry would adopt as little AI-produced imagery as humanly possible to avoid that slippery slope where we fast forward 10 years and we're all playing games that have never been touched by a real person. But at the same time, I think very small, non-essential tasks like this probably aren't going to move the needle too far in either direction. So taking into consideration the potential of Skynet seizing control of game ports, I would say that the visual experience you're going to get from playing any of the Legends of the Zone titles is either right at or microscopically close to what you would get with the original releases on PC. Now, we are, of course, going to talk about other aspects a little further on, but in terms of presentation, this is not just close enough to pass the bar, but probably close enough to fool a hardened veteran of the series that they were looking at these games running on their native platform, at least in terms of the 4K capable consoles. There are, of course, tons and tons of people out there who might want to try Stalker out but don't own a PS5 or a Series X, which is exactly why I was dumb enough to purchase a copy of Shadow of Chernobyl on the PS4 for a segment in this video that likely won't even hit 2 minutes of runtime. Because at this point, I'm so lost in my process, I feel the need to get real meta and compare a port of a port.
I owe you, brother. I could never thank you enough.
Alright, so on PS4, the Legends of the Zone collection is locked at 30 frames per second and outputs a 1080p picture. Getting in real close, I couldn't see any blurry details or smeary edges that leads me to believe it's internally hitting too far below that resolution target, but I could be wrong about that. If it is though, I would imagine it's something really close to 1080p, like maybe 900p. I wasn't able to see some of the dynamic image scaling going on here that you could find in the next-gen versions of these games, which makes sense. That's a hardware-level feature that came into mainstream prominence long after the tech in the PS4 was considered old school. Now, the very first thing on your mind right now might be Stalker at 30 FPS? That must feel awful. Which is what I thought, but I'm gonna level with you. The game feels a lot smoother than what I was expecting, and not just in terms of the performance. I mean, that definitely does help. Taking a look at the frame rate info, it does look like the game will dip into 26 or the 27 FPS region every so often, which is perfectly fine, but more than that, the frame pacing just felt surprisingly consistent overall. I came into this port expecting to get absolutely wrecked by SOC's already notorious bullet spongy enemies and inaccurate weapons, but I ended up doing pretty well. Of course, I was still aiming like absolute smelly ass, but putting down bandits and mutants felt no worse to me than it did in the 60 FPS versions of the game. I was really thrown for a loop with how good Shadow of Chernobyl felt at a noticeably lower resolution and half the frames per second. So if you are in the large camp of potential Stalker players that can't or don't want to get your hands on the 4K ready game consoles, I don't think you're going to be leaving as much on the table as you might initially expect. So by all means, don't be wary of a 30 FPS Stalker playthrough. It can deliver just about the same experience you'd be getting elsewhere. Alright, so shifting away from the visuals, what can you expect in terms of gameplay changes made to get these once PC exclusives working on console? Well, just like the last section, we've actually got a fair amount to discuss here. The first, most obvious one being the game's controls. Stalker on PC, like a lot of other FPS games on the platform, had a ton of functions tied to the act of actually playing it, so you might wonder how such a big list of keybinds would fit into a comparatively limited controller. And you know, I gotta admit, the transition is surprisingly smooth. Outside of moving and looking around with the analog sticks, you're given hotkeys for bandages and first aid kits on the D-pad, interact, jump, inventory, and confirm on the face buttons, aim and shoot on the two triggers, and the left shoulder button opens up the new radial menu, which is going to take care of some of Stalker's more specific keybinds. Outside of being able to quickly change between weapons, your detector, bolts, and binoculars, this screen also lets you take care of functions like activating night vision, changing fire modes, and switching ammo types. And you know, all things considered, it takes the place of its keyboard counterpart fairly well. Not quite as seamless as having access to a single key press that gets the same job done, but in terms of transferring this many different functions to a controller, I'd say it's a job well done. Now, what I'm about to say isn't exactly going to be a universal experience, but despite having to type up pages and pages of scripts for this channel every month, I never really learned how to get that job done without looking at my keyboard. I know, it's a little embarrassing, but that means when I play Stalker 2 on PC or really any other game, outside of obvious functions like run, crouch, prone, interact, or reload, I actually have to give a quick peek at my hands before I could do stuff like swapping fire modes or quick saving. So for people like me, this is actually a relatively efficient system. I haven't exactly crunched the numbers on whether or not it's faster for me to have to look down at my hands on PC or to use a few combined button presses presses on console, but I would say my familiarity with Stalker's keyboard controls probably edges out the controller just a bit. Getting back to the subject of people like me though, as I've already said at the start of the video, I really struggled with the analog stick controls in these games, but that wasn't something I could necessarily blame on the Legends of the Zone collection.
Well, here's the thing.
Now, there certainly was a time when I got most of my first and third person shooting done with a controller in my hands, but around the release of Max Payne 2, I started to gravitate more towards the PC for those games. And I guess after a while, my ability to aim with analog sticks atrophied away. Nowadays, I'm almost completely unable to play any kind of a shooting game with a controller, and since I am used to easily being able to do certain actions in Stalker, there was a bit of frustration there, which had a way of bleeding through into affecting the way I approach a typical playthrough of these games. I was needing to burn through way more ammo to score kills, which meant I would end up having to spend a lot more money than I was used to before leaving an outpost and heading off on a mission. But worry not, if you, like me, suffer from an inability to aim a reticle with your thumbs, Legends of the Zone does include a pretty robust set of auto-aim features. Alongside your more traditional hit the aim down sights button and the game will try to move you towards the closest target, you have the ability to automatically track that target if they start moving. That last one specifically sounded like a good idea on paper because I did need to do a little experimentation with the aimed move speed to get things feeling right, but in my case, more often than not, it seemed to work against me way more than it helped. I could have just been using it wrong, but the auto tracking always seemed to either be too far ahead or behind the target for me to actually get a hit off. So I ended up turning it off and compensated by cranking up the regular auto aim just a bit more. After finding a happy medium there and getting a few hours under my belt, I did eventually find an equilibrium that allowed me to do mostly okay in combat. So I would have to assume that most of you who are already used to this kind of control scheme are going to be able to jump into these games with no issues. The only thing that stood out to me as being kind of wonky was a lack of subtle movements when trying to adjust my aim while zoomed in with the scope. But heading into the controller options, they do have settings that you can tweak for just such an occasion, so that might have just meant that I needed to mess around a bit more. I think my only non-skill related issue in terms of the controls was a bit of inconsistency with the D-pad hotkeys. Across all three games, you have the ability to use bandages or first aid kits with a quick press of a direction on the D-pad, which works fine, but only in Call of Pripyat can you do the same thing with anti-rads or food. I swear I tried my hardest to find an option to assign D-pad presses to anything else in Clear Sky or Shadow of Chernobyl, but I didn't come across anything, which can really turn into an issue when you accidentally stumble across a heavily irradiated area on accident and you're trying to slam anti-rads as fast as possible. In these ports, you're going to have to head into your menu manually and navigate through each of your items till you get to the right one. Now, it didn't outright make the game impossible or anything, but it can make for a pretty annoying time if you find yourself in that sort of a situation and you don't have the most nimble of fingers. It does need to be said that Stalker, even among its most ardent supporters, is known for having an approach to FPS gameplay that might be a little more clunky than what most people are used to, and that issue is exacerbated to some degree by compressing its control scheme down to a much more limited platform. But you know, with that being said, if it did have to be done, I don't think it could have went more smoothly than this. After playing for a while and committing its new controls to memory, I did fall into a groove with using analog sticks to aim, and it felt surprisingly effective. Now, I don't think I could ever get my performance here on par with being able to use a mouse and keyboard, but for some that issue might be reversed. So what might be for me this port's single downside, and let me say it's a small one at that, may be the aspect that makes this a perfect series entry point for someone else. And I would say that's the key takeaway here. I'm sure there are plenty of people watching right now who would love to check out the Stalker series for the first time, or maybe they loved Stalker 2 and want to take a trip back to the franchise's past. I mean, if we're only going on the comment sections of my Stalker videos, there are a hell of a lot of people that fit into one of those descriptions. And in both of those cases, I can confidently say, the Legends of the Zone collection is just about perfect. Each entry is like 99.99999% accurate to its PC counterpart. So anyone playing this collection is going to get the exact same experience all of us did back when the PC originals launched, but with the added bonuses of all kinds of fixes, visual cleanups, and general housekeeping that'll make for a much more stable, reliable playthrough. Well, you know, stable for a Stalker game. And to further add to that argument, all 3 Legends of the Zone titles have mod support, which is something you certainly couldn't call common in the console space. Of course, you do need to keep your expectations in check. I'm sure Microsoft and Sony wouldn't want people having too much of a backdoor into their console's inner workings for understandable reasons, but a win is a win. Now, based on what I've seen, most of what's available for all 3 games stays in the realm of visual changes, but I can't tell you how strange it is booting up a game on my Xbox Series X and being able to browse user-made mods right from its title screen. I mean, hell, even if you choose not to take advantage of these mods, just the fact that they were included really shows that GSC was unbelievably dedicated to giving us the most true to the original ports that could humanly be achieved.
Helping out. Drop by our base sometime. We'll find a way to pay you back.
All of that being said, if you fall under the umbrella of a new or prospective fan of the series, you might be wondering exactly how to approach all of this. And without sounding like even more of a shill for GSC than I already do, I would genuinely recommend starting from Shadow of Chernobyl and working your way through both its prequel and sequel. A lot of people in the scene will often recommend that you skip over Stalker Clear Sky, and to be fair, I get that perspective to a degree. I mean, if you were there and played the game on launch, some of its more notorious issues could certainly have left a bad enough taste in your mouth to last a lifetime. But I gotta tell you, the Legends of the Zone version of the game is very well tuned comparatively. Weapons no longer possess the accuracy of your local weatherman's predictions, and on Stalker difficulty, the time to kill seems heavily improved. I might be crazy, but it sort of feels like you really need to play through all 3 games to really get an idea of how the series evolved, and that previous experience will make you appreciate its incremental improvements so much more. At the time of me writing this, buying all 3 games in a bundle will basically get you one of them for free, which, I'll be honest, also kind of plays into my recommendation. Regardless of which one you end up starting with or what order you decide on though, I can guarantee you're going to be jumping into the same exact games that Stalker fans enjoyed all those years ago, but with all the added performance, efficiency, and stability alterations that comes with the nearly 15 years that have passed since their release. I guess if we're going to sum all of this up into a single idea, if you're thinking about playing Stalker, you should. And if you're thinking about playing Stalker on console, you should. Trust me, I was really hoping for these to be terrible so I could drag the runtime of this video out to like 2 hours, but sadly, I can only talk about them being amazing for so long. And with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get back to work. Here's hoping you guys enjoy what you're about to get yourselves into. Oh, and happy hunting, Stalkers.
Where the hell are you? We're getting butchered!
そうなんですね。しかもですね、1位から7位まで。
Because this new T-Mobile phone is his mobile phone and his home phone.
Hello and welcome to X-Play, one of the 9 remaining bastions of communist sentiment in Hollywood.
The year was 2007. If you were watching cable TV, you could still find new episodes of X-Play airing. Skateboarding was enjoying a very well-earned second golden age. Bands like Impending Doom, Job for a Cowboy, and Whitechapel were establishing a firm foothold at the intersection of death metal and hardcore. And a young Avalanche Jared would soon sit right here, in this exact chair, in front of a 1280 by 1024 ViewSonic CRT bathed in the glow of Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. All things considered, it was an incredible time to be alive. In the years that followed this landmark release, GSC Game World would release 2 more entries in the Stalker franchise. And for those of us lucky enough to be a part of its cult following, each one would act like a window, a small opening that offered a brief glimpse into one of the most immersive, convincing, and flat-out magnetic game worlds ever made. After putting hundreds of hours into every single bit of officially released Stalker content that I could get my hands on, as well as tons of fan-made options, I lent my voice to the international chorus of fanatic supporters desperately pleading for just a little more. And for more than 15 years, due to factors ranging from petty mismanagement to international military conflict, the dream of a true and honest Stalker sequel would seem to be just that, a dream. And I think I'm man enough to admit that I became a little jaded, skeptical of the idea that I'd ever get another chance to visit this desolately haunting landscape. But if you're watching this video or listening to these words, you'll know that dream has, against all odds, finally become a reality. What could at one point be considered mere vaporware has somehow transcended the bonds of space and time and manifested itself. What I'm trying to say is, we finally have Stalker 2. And as you might be able to imagine, I am thrilled to say those words, but now that we passed from the realm of potential into real life, there are a few questions that might need some answering. I mean, it's been 15 years. The gaming industry is a vastly different place than what it was when this series had any sort of a presence in it. To put it bluntly, things have changed, and I think you could make a convincing argument for that change being oriented towards more bad than good. Concepts like uniqueness, novelty, and ambition have been replaced with reliability and predatory profit schemes. Not exactly the most ideal conditions for releasing an entry to a series well known for going against common game development orthodoxy. And that is exactly why we're here today, to determine whether or not this new entry in the Stalker series lives up to the pedigree of its name. And after putting 140 hours into it, I'd say I'm uniquely qualified for that job. So I hope all of you have held on to your Geiger counters and you've got a few stashes waiting for you on the other side, because we are most definitely heading back in. Stalkers, welcome to the zone. Alright, so before we get down to business, I think a refresher course is well overdue, as it's been 14 years since the release of the last Stalker game, and about 3 since I put out a video on the series. But for those of you already well versed in magic Soviet radiation lore, I'll have a timestamp on screen that'll get you past the new Stalker orientation. I've also set up this video's chapters pretty meticulously, so if I start going too in-depth for your taste, feel free to skip around. Trust me, I'm well aware I have a bit of a problem actually getting to the point most of the time. And lastly, I do want to mention that I was given this copy of Stalker 2 on PC by GSC Game World a little before the official launch for the purposes of this review. As usual, this included no expectation of a positive evaluation, and no money has or will change hands between me and the publisher/developer of the game. I'm not trying to say that I'm not for sale, I'm just saying I don't think GSC can afford me. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into this. Now, interestingly, the events that would eventually lead to the creation of the zone actually began around the 1960s, but we're going to go with the broad strokes here. If you are looking for a more detailed breakdown, I'd recommend videos from Gingy and Anomalous Dugout on the subject, which I'll link in the pinned comment. For our purposes, though, this strange story starts in the mid-afternoon of 1986, where the number 4 reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant melts down, causing a massive explosion and the release of untold amounts of radioactive material to be spread across the Ukrainian countryside. When the situation becomes far too large for the possibility of a cover-up, the Soviet government eventually evacuates the surrounding towns, cities, and villages, which leads to the creation of a 400-kilometer exclusion zone around the CNPP. While the events of this day were a tragedy the likes of which, hopefully, mankind will never see again, some saw this as more of an opportunity. A collection of radical scientists, simply known as the Group, used this military-enforced no-go zone as a perfect site for experiments and research that could have never been conducted out in the open under the prying eyes of people with pesky traits like basic human morality. Heading into the 90s, we see the collapse of the Soviet Union, which puts an end to all but one of the group's projects, arguably its most important one. This clandestine collection of eggheads had at some point discovered the existence of the noosphere, a metaphysical field that surrounds the Earth, somehow connecting the minds of all living beings and potentially has some level of control over reality as we know it. The group's research into the noosphere leads them to believe it's possible to tap into it and exert some sort of control over it with the goal of removing a few of humanity's more negative emotions like anger or greed. However, it seems like a single person can't really have a tangible effect on the noosphere, leading to 7 members of the group combining their minds into a common consciousness, or sea consciousness for short. By the early 2000s, the group has officially gone off the reservation, no longer reporting to or obeying the government, which is becoming an increasingly larger problem as people begin spreading rumors of strange laboratories and sightings of unidentifiable creatures in the zone. When 2006 rolls around, the Chernobyl exclusion zone would once again be the site of a major catastrophe. Officially known as the second disaster, this explosion of energy originating from the center of the zone results in its boundaries growing an additional 5 kilometers. Where before the zone was something the Ukrainian government was happy to ignore, it was now an existential threat, and so a campaign was launched to destroy whatever was at the heart of this issue. The members of the military embarking on this assignment report back with some unbelievable stories. They discovered pockets of altered reality littered around the zone where natural forces like fire, electricity, and gravity can manifest themselves in unnatural ways. They also confirmed previous reports of twisted, mutated creatures roaming the landscape and the existence of strange or impossible weather phenomena. Of course, without any knowledge of this dangerous terrain, this initial military push was a total failure, leaving the few surviving forces in the zone effectively trapped there. As time goes on and mankind slowly makes its way further into the zone, it's discovered that the aforementioned anomalous activity can sometimes produce artifacts with properties that break the laws of science. From balls of condensed frozen flames to perpetual energy batteries, these artifacts become a massive subject of scientific study, leading to the creation of a grassroots economy around them and the emergence of opportunists willing to brave the dangers of the zone to find and profit off of these artifacts. These people are eventually labeled stalkers, and as groups of them differing in ideology occupy more and more of the zone, they begin to gravitate towards forming coalitions known as factions. During this time, stalkers would start spreading rumors of a wish-granting object residing inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and there are plenty of other really interesting stories during this period. Faction wars and military operations, but to keep things simple, let's fast forward to 2011, the year a group of stalkers would be able to do what no one else could and successfully pierce the center of the zone, reaching the CNPP. The news that there was a path leading to the coveted center and the potential of coming across either the wish granter or a massive cache of untouched artifacts drives the zone's factions to the power plant where a large-scale firefight breaks out. As this goes down, presumably initiated by sea consciousness, a massive emission blasts through the zone once again. This either kills or incapacitates everybody present at the center, including the stalker that originally opened up the path there, Strelok. In an attempt at keeping stalkers away from their continuing efforts to either fix the noosphere or take control of it, common consciousness brainwashes the stalkers left alive near the power plant, turning them into Slavic Manchurian candidates. Each of these test subjects would have their memories wiped and be reinserted into stalker communities. Once there, they would begin living a fairly normal life just as they would have before, but now with the implanted mission of taking out specific targets that are getting too close to discovering the zone's secrets. 1 year later, in what I can only call a bureaucratic mix-up, the stalker Strelok was given the mission of finding and killing himself. Only he doesn't know that he's Strelok, so he spends most of his time retracing his own steps, which leads him right back to the center of the zone. Now aware of his own brainwashing, Strelok continues past the wish-granting monolith inside the CNPP and learns the truth about sea consciousness and how the zone was really formed. Furious at the revelation, Strelok helps the scientists' social standing by giving them all a series of very trendy full-body piercings. The destruction of sea consciousness causes the zone to become even more unstable and dangerous, and being a little tired of cheating death all the time, Strelok links up with the remains of yet another failed military operation for a timely evac. Alright, and now with this Cliff Notes version of events, you have officially been brought up to speed.
I believe the wonders that we will bring to the world far outweigh the potential risks.
How big are these risks exactly?
The zone reveals a whole new world.
Stalker 2's story, to borrow a very tired cliche, starts off with a bang. The year is 2021, and we're taking on the perspective of our main character, Skiff, as he's woken up by an anomaly forming in his kitchen, followed by an explosion that takes out most of his apartment and, honestly, a big portion of the building it resides in. In the rubble, Skiff finds an artifact, and since by this point the world's been fairly educated on what goes down in the zone, Skiff knows that this thing that destroyed his home might ironically be his only hope at getting some quick cash and not joining Europe's homeless population. So he gets into contact with the same Dr. Herman we met in Kola Pripyat and arranges a deal. It seems like artifacts that leave the exclusion zone tend to lose their anomalous properties and thus their value, so the new plan is to trespass into the zone and use a device that can gather the anomalous energy there to essentially recharge his artifact.
I won't let you bust it down the shit.
This stone owes me a new home.
And you know that plan goes about as well as you can expect, right up until it doesn't. Their contact inside the zone, Solder, seems to have sold them out, and the result is not one, but two separate groups of potential thieves converging on Skiff's location. After a nice little three-way firefight, Skiff ends up on the business end of a magazine-fed 12-gauge held by another returning face from the Stalkerverse, Nimble. So now, sans artifact, our guy is sort of stuck in the zone with nothing worthwhile to do other than track down his missing payday and the people that took it from him. After this dense but relatively brief introduction, it was obvious to me that Stalker 2 was going to be a much more story-driven game compared to its predecessor. A prediction that 140 hours later turned out to be very true. Now, I've been criticized in the past for saying that all three Stalker games were pretty light in the traditional storytelling department, but that's a hill I'm willing to die on. Of course, there's a nearly bottomless hole of lore and explanations for all kinds of aspects of this game world, but I think that's the key word here. The world of Stalker has been given a very dense and rich history that spans all the way back to the 60s, and that's not even counting all the information we have on auxiliary subjects like the zone's mutants, the Project X experiments, and a vast history of certain locations and anomalies. Believe me, it's a subject worthy of getting lost in. I mean, there's a nearly infinite amount of tidbits you can learn about the zone's factions alone. But outside the first entry, Shadow of Chernobyl, there's been next to no personal tales told in the series. The average Stalker story will give you a very high-quality motivation for your main character to pursue their goals here in the exclusion zone, but will then proceed to spend about 80% of its runtime inundating you with lore regarding the ground beneath your feet. And to be upfront and honest, that is not something that I'm complaining about. It's actually what I would call one of the series' most interesting accomplishments. Each one gives you a unique set of eyes to view its events through, but for every entry, the real main character remains the zone itself. Now, would I love to know more about Scar or Major Degtyarev? Of course, but if I'm being real here, there's no way I could learn something about either of them that could even approach being more interesting than abandoned underground labs filled with national secrets and mutants that can use telekinesis to shoot you with your own gun. Without a doubt, this series has developed a very interesting approach to its storytelling, one that I love immensely, and had Heart of Chernobyl followed in those same footsteps, you would not be hearing a single critique from me. Which, in a lot of ways it does that. But without shifting focus away from the zone, Stalker 2 also squeezes in a more character-driven narrative taking place congruently. It's kind of the best of both worlds. Getting back to the events at hand, though, our guy Skiff is now in possession of a pistol, the clothes on his back, and a desire for revenge, making him fit in pretty well here. And from a storytelling perspective, the long road towards repossessing his stolen artifact cuts a straight line through the zone's most recent state of affairs. Now, on the plus side, familiar factions like Duty, Freedom, the Ecologist, Mercs, and the military are all still roaming around in some capacity, but they're now sharing the zone with plenty of new faces. First and most important is the Ward, which is basically the militaristic enforcement arm of Circa, a scientific organization started with the goal of researching the anomalous zone, which came into being after Strelok left in Kola Pripyat and shared his findings with the outside world. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got Spark. These guys are a group that works with the ecologists or any scientist not aligned with Circa and seem to have an almost religious devotion to the idea that the zone, in all of its negativity, is actually hiding something positive. They call this Stalker version of Heaven the Shining Zone, and on an interesting note, these guys are led by Scar from Stalker Clear Sky, but don't worry, we're gonna get into that soon enough. Outside of the major players, we've also got Noontide, a pretty secretive faction made up of ex-Monolith fighters. After the events of Shadow of Chernobyl, the Wish Granter, or Monolith, was destroyed, and so was its control over the brainwashed Monolithians, which is a good thing. The only real issue is that the rest of the zone isn't exactly keen on the idea of sharing space with the maniacs responsible for the deaths of an uncountable number of stalkers.
Anytime a Nooner walks out that gate, there's always some stalker who thinks that killing him is the right thing to do.
This being the case, Strider, a familiar face from Call of Pripyat, collected all of the former Monolith members together and carved out their own little corner of the zone, far away from the people who hate them. Skiff's quest to regain possession of his artifacts starts off with some info on where he can find Sauter, the stalker that sold him out in the intro, and in the course of this little interrogation, we end up being the least of this guy's worries.
It's a huge pile of trash, you can't miss it. It's north of... goddamn bread.
So after saving him from death, only to threaten him with it later, Sauter points us a little further down the line to the garbage. Here we play a familiar game for the series, doing favors for people with info to get far enough into their good graces that they decide to share it with us. This, however, comes with a major downside. It's not exclusively a two-party system, meaning the people that we've been talking to have been doing a little talking of their own. And when Skiff gets back with a small update, he finds out that the ward has requested one of those sit-downs you can't really say no to. During the conversation, not only do we get to see what happens when people who are actually familiar with firearms make a video game, but Skiff also learns that it's not just him and the thief that's looking to get a hold of this artifact. The ward's got some designs for it themselves, and if the ward wants it, that means Circa does, which is when we're introduced to Dahlan, the current head of Circa. After introducing himself, he doesn't exactly make it clear why, but it does seem like both the ward and Circa are willing to work with Skiff in order to obtain this artifact. And you know, while we're here, I probably should mention how conversations in Heart of Chernobyl differ from series doctrine, and also kind of how they've stayed the same. I think the first obvious change that a fan of the series is going to notice is how dialogue is no longer handled via text boxes you might be more likely to see in an RPG than an FPS. All three previous Stalker games used this method to deliver a good 90% of their exposition, and they were honestly kind of cool. Like I said, you didn't see a lot of FPS games in the mid-2000s handle conversations this way outside of CRPGs, and it made the franchise feel sort of unique in that sense. In fact, there tends to be at least the passing mention of role-playing when classic Stalker is discussed here online, and I would assume this dialogue system contributes to that trend to some degree. In Heart of Chernobyl, however, you've got a little more of a recognizable system that'll just zoom into the character you're talking to. No cool-looking interfaces made up of rusted metal and radiation symbols, and honestly, I'm not sure how I feel about that. On one end, there's literally nothing wrong with this approach. I mean, it works fine, but I don't know, at least some semblance of the series' charm isn't present because of it. It's not exactly a galaxy-sized change, and to be frank, the only difference is an aesthetic one, but I will admit the old text boxes really gave Stalker games a very cool visual appeal. Each entry would have a different take on the way these things would look, but you could always count on their design being visually integrated into the world of the zone in a really kind of immersive way. You know, actually, this might be a bit of a tangent, but I do sort of miss the lost art of video game interfaces. I remember a time when art teams would fill the screen with really intricate and, more importantly, thematically appropriate designs. Inventory screens and heads-up displays used to look like something you might actually find in the game world. Either that, or they were so damn artistically pleasing that it didn't really matter if they added to the immersion or not. Hell, old Japanese PC games were like 75% static HUD graphics, and they still look better than a lot of modern games to my eye. I don't really know if I can pinpoint exactly when people started moving away from this approach, but the first time I remember actively taking notice was around the transition to the HD era with the Xbox 360 and PS3. It seems like since then the emphasis has shifted from intricate and flashy to minimalist and transparent, but this is a complaint so far from the point that not even I can justify yapping much longer about it. So what do you say we actually get back to Stalker 2? And I will say, on the plus side, the series has not lost its emphasis on giving the player meaningful choices to make. In fact, I'd say this is the most any Stalker game has ever focused on the idea. Now, admittedly, the majority of choices in the game aren't going to affect its ending in any way, but a very commendable amount do, and the less important ones still provide a nice little role-playing adjacent kind of service. In my first run, I imagined Skiff as being the type of guy who knows how to put people in the ground, but would like the option not to unless his life was genuinely in danger. So even stalkers who ended up screwing me over with bunk stash locations or ones that would send me into mutant-infested buildings would get off with a stern warning and not a series of 5.56 rounds in their skull. It's certainly not a new or even innovative idea, but from the very start, Stalker games have given the player some sort of granular control over what kind of person their main character is, and I'm really happy that that seems to be working overtime in this sequel. While talking to them, I really didn't like what I'd seen of the wards so far, and I didn't know enough about Circa to throw in with them just yet, so I decided to keep what little info I had close to my pocket, and they didn't like that so much, but I could care less because I was pointed towards the direction of Noontide. On the way to their base, though, Skiff runs into an old faction from the early days of the zone, Spark. This new version being resurrected by Scar. It seems like after his run-in with Sea Consciousness and going through the same mental wipe that Strelok did during the events of Clear Sky, Scar's been driven not exactly mad, but let's just say the guy's a few rounds short of a full magazine.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Would you like some toast?
And by this point, you really shouldn't be surprised, but Spark is also after Skiff's artifact. Scar explains that their intention is to find the Shining Zone, a place that you could sort of call heaven on Earth. According to Spark, the zone has a dark side, which is responsible for the things like mutants and zombified stalkers roaming around, but there's also a good side to the zone. A place where a person could achieve some semblance of immortality and spread peace to the rest of the world. And just as a real quick aside, I get that Scar was using these zombies to make a point here in this scene, but I don't think I've ever come across the reason that they didn't attack him or anyone else in the building for that matter. The best I can figure is that his brain was also scrambled by Sea Consciousness, so he seems like one of them, maybe? I'm not really sure. Feel free to drop a comment if you know, because I'd love to know the real reason. Anyways, after this, Scar gets us an inn with Noontide, and after gaining access to their little section of Wild Island, Skiff finds the ex-Monolithians in a bit of a soft civil war. On one end is their leader, Strider. After the monolith was destroyed at the end of Shadow of Chernobyl, he took the initiative to gather up all of his fellow brainwashies in an attempt at keeping them safe from the rest of the zone's denizens. And at least from what we can tell, he's done a pretty good job of that so far. But amongst his faction, there's a growing movement of Monolithians who actually think their near zombified state at the hands of the monolith was a good thing. Led by the blind stalker Faust, these religious fundamentalists believe that the monolith really is a god and thus could never actually be destroyed, which puts them at odds with Strider's isolationist live and let live approach for the group. Faust, from what we can tell, is pretty damn charismatic and, well, he'd have to be, because later we would find out that he was able to turn a member of the ward to his side. After finding the guy, he seems to be in the grip of a psi-induced manic state, and Skiff ends up having to pacify him.
I'm sorry, but I can't leave any witnesses.
On his PDA, though, we get pointed towards the faction Clear Sky, which is great in terms of fans of the series getting such a cool callback to Stalker Clear Sky, but bad in the sense that everyone in that group either died or was converted to Monolithians after that game's events. So Skiff heads off to play detective again and eventually finds out that the only person alive who actually knows how to find the Clear Sky base, to the best of anyone's knowledge, is the prolific guide Nimble, another name that fans of the series are going to be very familiar with. Once we actually track him down, there doesn't seem to be much time to question him, as he's currently smack dab in the middle of what could charitably be called a suicide mission.
I don't know who you are, Stalker, but you best run.
After the dust settles, Skiff recognizes Nimble as one of the stalkers present when he got robbed at the game's start, and another good old-fashioned fistfight breaks out. Now, like I said before, I don't really see Skiff as the angry hitman type, so I let Nimble off the hook, which ended up being a pretty valuable move as he lets us know that it was Faust who hired him to steal the artifact, which means whatever that blind zealot is planning over at the Noontide base might actually lead us in the direction of getting it back. And before heading off, Nimble clues Skiff in on how to disable the psi emitters that have continued to keep Clear Sky's base hidden from the rest of the zone. By the way, quick sidebar, I've always pronounced this word as psi because it made sense to me. You know, like psychic. Only, I guess I'm an idiot because I just found out that that's not how you spell psychic. So I want you all to be aware I'm going to continue pronouncing it wrong throughout the video because, I already said it, I'm an idiot. Moving on, Skiff finally makes it to the Clear Sky base and after outrunning an emission comes across Faust, who seems to be in the process of inventorying the state of all of his followers. And in what I can only call an Easter egg to the previous Stalker game's broken stealth system, Skiff fails to sneak up on a blind man.
Wait just a second, Skiff.
On the plus side, though, he does get his artifact back, which means it's the end of Skiff's involvement in all of the messy, overlapping politics of the zone. Only thing left to do now is complete his original goal, sell the artifact to the highest bidder and get some sort of compensation for the hardship that it's caused him. And since we know Circa is really well funded, looking for the artifact and happens to be nearby, Skiff heads off to what is looking to be the end of the game. Before taking off though, I really wanted to look around the Clear Sky base, and honestly this ended up being a pretty magical moment for me. I've always had a special place in my heart for what people consider to be the worst game in the Stalker series, and getting to look around the desolate corpse of this familiar location, it really hit me in all the right ways. In fact, I was coming across experiences like this at a breakneck pace in this game. I'll get into it more when we talk about its gameplay, but you really can't deny the pure nostalgic value of being able to revisit almost every single location seen across all 3 Stalker games that came before this one. For people like me who put hundreds and hundreds of hours into each of those entries, it's almost a religious experience. Not only seeing those familiar landmarks get a modern 4K visual representation, although that is pretty amazing, but more importantly, you get to see what these places are like all these years after the last time you set foot in them. Chronologically speaking, it's been something like 15 years since the events of the last game in the series, and personally speaking, some of the best aspects about picking up the next Stalker game has always been being able to see how places like Yantar or Agroprom have changed. Like I've said a million times by now, me and a lot of other fans of the series have put some serious time into these games, and in the process, as you might imagine, we formed a pretty close connection to the setting. That's most of the reason that I fell in love with Stalker in the first place, and it might be kind of hard to explain outside of a 2-hour-long video essay dedicated solely to this subject, but I think I might be able to get you newbies most of the way there. When you were a kid, did you ever have to move to a new town or change schools? Well, imagine if you could see those places from your childhood right now. Imagine if you got to experience the dissonant feeling of incredible familiarity combined with seeing how radically different it is today. Well, I got to experience something approximating that situation, honestly so many times I couldn't possibly count them all while playing Stalker 2. Now, I know all this isn't going to have any value to somebody who's watching this video with the intent of finding out whether or not they'll like this game, but I think it might go a long way in demonstrating why I did so much. And besides, this is my video. I'll get to the point when I want to.
You shouldn't tell me what to do. Screw you.
Speaking of which, getting back to Skiff's potential rag to riches story, our guy heads off in the direction of Circa's home base here in the zone. Before we get there though, Scar gets back in touch, only this time he's teamed up with Strider and somehow they've come across a bombshell piece of info. Apparently, Circa's not only found the Wish Granter, but they've transported it to their base. Now, if you're somehow just tuning into this video, or more likely this series, the Wish Granter has always been a rumor among experienced stalkers. If you can accomplish the impossible and get to the center of the zone, inside the CNPP you'll find an object that has the ability to essentially give you whatever you want. Interestingly, while the book A Roadside Picnic, the movie Stalker, and the games that stemmed from both don't really share the same plot, they all have a Wish Granter. During the events of Shadow of Chernobyl, we find out this thing is a monkey's paw. a distraction that would trick anyone crazy enough to progress far enough into the zone that sea consciousness would need to worry about them discovering their little apocalyptic experiments. And the very same wish granter served as the monolith, which brainwashed all the members of Noontide back in Strelok's day. So, like you might be able to imagine, the idea of a vertically integrated, well-funded, and overly ambitious scientific organization getting their hands on this thing is going to be bad news for quite literally everybody in the zone. And sadly, it's also bad news for anyone looking to avoid spoilers. So I'm going to put a timestamp up on screen that you can skip to if you'd like to uncover all of this on your own. So feel free to jump ahead and we'll meet back up again in a bit. Once Skiff makes it to Circa's little sectioned-off portion of the zone, he's all but warmly welcomed into the facility by Dahlan himself after flashing the scanner and the artifact at the gate. Offering him a place to rest up for a bit, Dahlan reveals that Circa's goal, for the moment, is to use what he's calling the Alpha artifact to connect to the generators, a series of conduits that could be found in the previous Stalker games. It seems like these things, past making for some ominous-as-hell set dressing, siphon anomalous energy from the noosphere and use it to power all of the sea consciousness, machines, labs, and equipment. So Dahlan's plan, since he can't find a way to harvest the zone's energy himself, is to just piggyback off the generators, which will create what appears to be an infinite energy source for the people outside of the zone, removing the, or at least one of the more common issues behind international conflict. And, you know, honestly, at this point, I could see myself being convinced to join up with Circa. I mean, Dahlan doesn't appear to be some kind of a shady actor working for his own ends. The guy genuinely wants to capitalize on the abject negativity of the zone and provide some sort of a tangible good from it. Besides all the story-based stuff, while we're at Circa, we get a chance to look around, and it was really jarring for me visually. I mean, I don't think throughout the entire 4-entry franchise we've ever gotten a chance to see a single surface that wasn't covered in dirt, rust, grime, or radioactive material. During this little tour, though, we find out that Dahlan's big success with the organization is pioneering the tech that allowed Circa to essentially vat grow their own artifacts. Through what I can only call anomaly harvesting, they've been able to reproduce the conditions necessary for just about every artifact any stalker's ever come across before, which might actually explain why selling artifacts in this game makes you next to no money. Interrupting our little walking tour, something weird goes down, causing chaos to erupt as anomalies and mutants start running rampant. And since we're not looking to wait around for Circa's bureaucratic red tape to kick in, Skiff opts to take care of this himself. In doing so, Skiff runs back into Professor Herman from the intro, who apparently orchestrated all the current insanity. Herman, disgruntled that his tech is being used outside the bounds he originally imagined for it, lets Skiff know that Dahlan was actually the cause of the explosion that brought us here in the first place. Apparently, he was running an experiment that was supposed to manifest the Alpha artifact, but when it didn't go to plan, the result was anomalies and the Alpha appearing outside of the zone. So we head back to the labs with the intention of having a calm, respectful dialogue with the good doctor.
You need to lay up the booze.
And to be honest, we probably could have finished the job right there because the Colonel didn't exactly seem keen on stepping in. But as he was getting his windpipe crushed, Dahlan reveals that it was actually Scar who played a role in sabotaging the Alpha experiment. This moral quandary is a perfect example of a narrative tool that's been in use since the series started, and it's only going to get more common as we move on. Essentially, there's no one here in the zone that's running on moral purity. Everyone here has an idea of what they think would be best for the zone or for humanity as a whole, and to be honest, each one of them makes some damn convincing arguments for their position. And the major players you come across during the course of the game aren't exactly looking to make any friends. They've all got goals they're trying to achieve, and at best, they're more interested in recruiting a few more chess pieces to their side of the board. Both Spark and Circa don't necessarily care about Skiff or what he wants, but instead how he's able to help them. And to be completely fair, you could probably say the same thing about Skiff depending on the choices that you end up making throughout the game. You do have the ability to throw your support behind any of the factions involved and stick with them, but you could also just chase Skiff's goals and remain a neutral party only interested in joining forces with whoever's going to make that happen. And speaking of which, after getting chokeslammed, Dahlan confirms that they do have the monolith here in the facility, and in the hopes of testing that the Alpha artifact will get it working again, they want Skiff to interact with it. Here you can experience the non-canon Wish Granter endings from Shadow of Chernobyl, which is really fun, but more importantly, you can have Skiff wish for all of this to be over, which triggers the ward to attack him, killing him so all of it ends. But after the dust settles, Skiff finds out that the Wish Granter works solely in the realm of illusion, and he was never really in any danger. Regardless, though, this was all just meant to test the Alpha artifact, and apparently these results mean that Dahlan can indeed tap into the generators now. There's only one slight snag, if you can call it that. Siphoning the power source behind all of this, outside of supply